Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk more about specifically the Middle Passage, what it was like, and also some of the larger consequences of slavery beyond the obvious, how slavery was different in the New World than the Old World. I talked a little bit about this before, but we're going to look at the consequences of the emergence of racial slavery, which of course was distinct from slavery that existed in the Old World, whether it be sort of the African Maghreb, the Mediterranean, the Islamic empires, or sort of slavery that had existed in ancient Rome and Greece. So, as I said, slavery was not a new phenomenon. It had existed in the ancient world. It had existed in the Islamic world. It also existed in Africa. Indeed, the video you just watched with Professor Steve Rockel talked about sort of the consequences of the slave trade on Africa. But of course, this was a new kind of slavery. In the past, slavery was really about servants attached to households, some artisans. But here, with the rise of the plantation complex, you get two main differences. One, it's on a larger scale. Again, I don't want to use the term industrial, but it is certainly commercial agriculture. And of course, it is based on race. Now, in fact, you could argue, and a lot of historians have argued, that race emerges as a modern concept because of the rise of the plantation complex in the New World. In past, slaves were not differentiated by the color of their skin. But in the New World, bonded status meant essentially black skin. The invention of race has very important consequences for the rise of the slave trade. The way in which this emerges, this sort of form of inequality emerges and helps facilitate the rise and spread of capitalist relations later. As we'll see later, capitalism thrives on the production of difference, partly because it ensures that workers remain divided at this point. Also, as we are seeing for the first time, human beings emerging as commodities, and important commodities to the world system. This is literally the commodification of human beings, the trading, the buying and selling of human beings that have an actual value to them that you can write down in numbers. At this point, this had never really happened. So what you're getting is the commodification of human beings at this point. So if we go to the next slide here, one I just sort of talked about. I'll pause on it in a minute so you can look at it. But the next slide is not easy to look at, I will warn you. And it is an image that has been around for a long time, that had circulated in abolitionist circles in the 18th century, the late 18th century and the early 19th century, when the sort of movement to abolish slavery first got going in specifically Britain. And eventually it spreads to the northeastern United States. And of course, in the United States, it would culminate in 1860 with the Civil War. And in the case of the British, slavery would eventually be outlawed by the 1830s. So just to warn you, this next slide is not easy to look at. It's a rendering, it's not a photo, so it's bad, but okay. This is what a slave ship looked like. Now, this is the Brookes slave ship in 1788. As you can see how horrendous and awful these conditions were. And it really speaks to just the dehumanization of people as commodities at this point. These are individual people in these holds. You were basically trying to stuff as many people as you could, if you were a slave trader, to increase your profit margins as much as possible. They would have lived in absolute filth, squalor, and for the most part, absolute terror. About 12 to 15% did not survive. It was full of disease, they were underfed, and of course, when you arrived in the New World, after you survived this awful journey that would have taken months, remember, right? As awful as it is, this isn't a few days. People are jammed together in these quarters. There's no bathroom, there's nothing. They're treated like livestock. And they're jammed together for what could be as much as 2 to 3 months while they make the trek across the Middle Passage. Now, what emerges from this horrible system, as we'll see in a minute, is the triangle of trade. Now, some of you may have studied the triangle of trade before. I think sometimes it's covered in high school. But the triangle of trade, and we'll look at a graphic in a minute, is basically, as the slide says here, human commodities involved in the triangle of trade. So Europe went to Africa in the case of these, chartered companies that were engaged in the slave trade, and they traded cloth, weapons, alcohol, metal, cheap manufactured goods in exchange for slaves. And so the slaves that were bought from people on the west coast of Africa were then transported from Africa to the Americas, whether it be Brazil or the Caribbean or the southern United States. And then agricultural products produced by slave labor in the Caribbean, the southern United States, or Brazil, was then transported back to Britain. So, or Europe generally. So if you can see in the next slide, it's kind of a crude slide here, but you get the sense. Now, the system does not emerge overnight. We've moved very fast, a couple of hundred years from the emergence of slavery in the Spanish and Portuguese Empire to the late 18th and the early 19th century. It becomes a mature, dynamic system at this point, and you can see how the triangle of trade worked. Sort of cloth, alcohol, and weapons to Africa, people as commodities and property to the Americas, specifically the Caribbean, and then raw material, agricultural products, sugar, cotton, coffee, tobacco, back to Europe. This created a sort of Atlantic trading system that was then integrated to the global economy. So what also emerges out of this is that it seems that all the elements, or sort of all the financial apparatuses that are necessary to assist with the rise of capitalism, banks, brokerage houses, all come into being before industrial capitalism emerges. And a lot of them come into being as a result of the slave trade. This is before the rise of factories. So the point here is that again, to emphasize that point, historians used to see slavery as a vestige of the feudal past, something that was incompatible with capitalism that they thought would sort of fade away. But what I want to suggest here is that this new form of slavery was actually central to the emergence of capitalism. It played a crucial role in the takeoff of this Atlantic trading system. A little later, we will be looking at in the next video, the last video, the way that sort of the rise of cotton is essential to the emerging sort of British industrial sector in the 19th century. But also we will look in the coming weeks at how not even just slavery, but the very concept of unfree labor persists as capitalism starts to emerge and spread. Prior to this, people saw unfree labor as incompatible with capitalism, that capitalism was really about free wage labor. And yet, unfree labor persisted and still persists to this day. In fact, chocolate, most chocolate that you get, even companies that say they will guarantee that their chocolate was not used in slave labor, it's very difficult for it not to be. In fact, the chocolate industry is probably one of the dirtiest industries in the world in terms of unfree labor, probably even dirtier than the oil industry. So it's just something to consider. And we'll look at that a little bit later. Now, in the next and final video, finally, we will look at sort of the conclusion, and we'll return to the main argument about slavery and capitalism and its consequences for the development of capitalism and industrialism for the rest of the world.